We are smack in the middle of Amazon's Prime Day, or make that Prime Days. The extravaganza is now a 4-day event after the company last month decided it needed to be extended. Why? The same reason that consumer credit balances and revolving credit declined in the latest figures. Consumers' hearts might be in it, but their wallets aren't. Even Amazon's merchants are struggling. Prime Day, or now Prime Days, is usually a showcase of deals and discounts. Instead, there are widespread reports which indicate fewer are going to be able to even participate since they're already being squeezed on costs, which comes at the worst time. Consumers are indeed pulling back everywhere you look. Again, the fact that Amazon decided to go to a 4-day period already tells you this year really is different. We see that in a whole host of economic data too. For example, what everyone missed in the last payroll report, average weekly paychecks declined on a 3-month basis through June. And not only for the first time since August of 2020, we only see this happen on a handful of occasions over the last 30 years. And of those few, when it did happen, obviously nothing was good going on in the economy and the labor market. And so revolving consumer credit falling all over again really does fit with all this other macroeconomic evidence, up to and including Amazon's decision to make its Prime Day into a 4-day event. The consumer economy really does appear to have hit a wall, as the evidence, unlike sales, is really piling up all over the place. Now, what Amazon itself said last month when it made this decision, at least according to Vice President Jamil Ghani, what he told the Associated Press, was that shoppers wanted more time to shop and save. I mean, that's certainly the corporate spin. But as NBC News reported just yesterday, analysts are unsure that the extra days will actually translate into more purchases, given that renewed inflation worries, not really inflation worries, it's income worries, and potential price increases from tariffs may make consumers less willing to spend, and that's why it's a 4-day event. Amazon doesn't disclose Prime Day sales figures, but said last year that the event achieved record global sales, which is utterly meaningless because they achieve record global sales every single year. It's by how much that actually matters. Even Bloomberg is skeptical here. It said yesterday, Prime Day will be quite a test, at least according to Romain Fouache, who's the CEO of Akeneo, which sells software used by online merchants. The firm conducted a survey of 1,000 U.S. shoppers showing that 1 in 4 respondents plan to skip Prime Day or Prime Days due to tariffs. It's really income, not tariffs, while 57% said they would more closely monitor prices. And it's not just shoppers sitting out the sale. Some online merchants who provide about 60% of the products sold on Amazon's web store say they can't afford to offer discounts this year because they're trying to boost prices to offset the increased costs from tariffs. Input costs are going up, business isn't robust, they have no room to do so, and this is the reason why the consumer economy is in trouble to begin with. This is another angle on businesses as employers being squeezed. They can't afford what they have now, so they have to make adjustments in labor, which leads to the self-reinforcing loop where consumers see that incomes are in jeopardy, they pull back in spending, putting even more pressures on employers, which means they pull back in labor, and on we go. The evidence continues to pile up. And this is exactly the scenario or set of scenarios that was been laid out by the interest rate swap market, which is why we're going to go through what the swap market said and what it's saying now in our anniversary sale webinar coming tomorrow, July 10th, Thursday, 6 p.m. Eastern. There's a link in the description to sign up if you want to participate. This is your last chance to go over what it is that swaps are doing, the big bets they're making, and why it all matters, and what it can tell us about how everything is going from here and what we should expect moving forward. Like I said, there's a link in the description. Tomorrow night, Thursday, July 10th, 6 p.m. I do hope to see you there. If we go back to the Bloomberg article, it brings us a couple of anecdotes about merchants who are exactly, just as they said, those who would like to participate in Prime Day, but because Prime Day means discounts and lower prices, they can't actually do so because they can't afford to do so. The input costs have gone up so much that they can't actually lower prices. They need to raise them just to remain even steady, to have the hope of staying steady. One of those was Dan Pescourse, whose Upstream Brands sells aluminum trays that make decorative ice cubes for cocktail connoisseurs. He usually sells his products at cost on Prime Day to promote the brand, but with them subject to 50% tariffs, he's not offering any discounts for the first time. We're just going to see what happens this year, he said, whose company generates about $4 million in annual sales, mostly on Amazon. There's just no room in the budget for Prime Day discounts. Unilever PLC's Blue Air, which makes air purifiers and humidifiers, had to reduce the number of products it offers for sale during the Prime Day this year due to tariffs. The sale is a good way to promote the company's products, including filters that cost as much as $300 and typically feature a Prime Day discount of about 30%. And the CEO said, "We want to be cautious to see how this economy plays out for the rest of the year," which is exactly why Prime Day is now 4 days. Everybody knows this is happening. Everybody knows this is taking place. Costs have gone up and the business just isn't there. And those businesses that do try to increase costs see their volume go down. That's what we see in consumer spending. And it all goes back to the labor market. Jay Powell says it's solid. Everybody said the last payroll report looked relatively good. None of that is true. And we have evidence for it all over the place. Labor market weakness has led to the consumer economy hitting a wall. And now we have all this evidence of the consumer economy hitting the wall. We don't really even need to work backwards, but we can. As Bloomberg also added in its article, economic indicators have so far portrayed a resilient U.S. consumer, but the long-term outlook could be muddied by short-term shopping savviness, such as buying automobiles before tariffs take effect. And almost none of that is true. The evidence that we continue to get shows that the consumer economy has absolutely changed in a meaningful way, and not just for a month or two here, but the entire year of 2025 so far. It's adding up all over the place, from the labor market, where it really starts, through incomes to now spending. It only looks solid for those who aren't paying close attention, which is most people, since most people just don't have time to sit here and study the economy. That's why Jay Powell is able to influence how people think, because the vast majority believe he, first of all, knows what the hell he's talking about when he doesn't, and second, that he's not heavily biased with a self-serving agenda, which of course he and the Federal Reserve absolutely is. And that brings us to the latest data provided by the Federal Reserve itself on consumer credit up to the month of May 2025. And while overall consumer credit was higher in that month, that was due entirely to non-revolving balances, which tend to be more interest rate sensitive, whereas revolving balances, or those tied to credit cards, actually declined, and it's credit card usage that is more macro sensitive. That is, consumers' perceptions of what's happening with jobs and incomes. Another data point that goes along with everything else that we got so far, that consumers are not seeing anything solid or positive where it comes to employment. The Federal Reserve said total credit in May, consumer credit, rose by just $5.1 billion, which is well below the $12 billion that was expected. That was after a big month in April, about $17 billion, with all the tariff beating to buy automobiles and other purchases. Non-revolving credit in the month of May was responsible for all of the increase, rising $8.6 billion, which is relatively steady to where it had been in April. But it was revolving credit that declined, falling by a pretty sharp $3.5 billion in the month of May after being up $7.5 billion in April. We do see the tariff front-loading distortions in consumer, especially revolving credit as well. Revolving credit is far more macro sensitive, as I said, because consumers will forego adding to credit lines. They'll also apply for fewer cards. They'll use the ones that they have even less. And in more extreme macro circumstances, they'll actually pay down the debt that they've already taken out. It's all a set of prudent defensive tactics that are reserved for when a large proportion of workers are unsure about their job prospects and are worried about their incomes. What the data shows is that there was a very clear change in credit card behavior last year around March, the global inflection that we talked about all through 2024. That was the labor market dip that led to last summer's, quote, recession scare. So the growth in aggregate revolving credit balances had slowed down to practically zero by August, confirming that recession scare, or at least the economy's dramatic slowdown up until that point. By the time we got to August, the average increase in revolving balances was down to almost zero, but then fast forward a couple months, and November saw a huge decline in credit card debt outstanding. But from there, like we see in a lot of other macroeconomic statistics, consumer usage of credit cards picked up modestly as a response to that same artificial high, especially in December. Now, January showed a little bit of a slowdown, and February is basically back to zero again, as weakness was evident everywhere, especially in spending. Then you had a small pickup in March and a bigger pickup in consumer credit, revolving credit, due to the tariff distortion front-loading in April. Now May, we're back to a big reduction, nearly $3.5 billion, which puts more emphasis on the hard data, not merely sentiment surveys. As everybody said, it's just consumer sentiment's worried. Consumers are worried and pessimistic over tariffs. That's not the case. The hard data, which has indicated that something big has changed. And while we don't want to make too much out of a single month of especially credit card estimates, which is a series that tends to be very noisy, however, if something big did change for the consumer economy and the labor market, we'd expect exactly this, a sharp decline in non-revolving credit to show up relatively quickly. It fits with so many other data points. The one that doesn't fit is the headline payroll number from the establishment survey. Even the rest of the establishment survey itself argued against the mainstream interpretation of the headline. In fact, the headline itself was saved by all those teacher jobs. So even the mainstream interpretation of the payroll report doesn't stand up to even the slightest bit of scrutiny. So while half the job gains in the month of June, according to the establishment survey, were teachers or thereabouts, some form of government job, that wasn't even the worst of it. The hours index slid by 0.3%, which is the worst monthly decline in a year, and it contradicted the idea that there was a substantial or solid increase in the number of employees. If there was, if we take this at face value, what that would mean is these jobs that were gained were all part-time or similar. The big one, though, related to hours, is average weekly earnings for production and non-supervisory workers. Their paychecks. That one also declined by 0.3% in June, which is already somewhat unusual. But the fact that it's the second decline in 3 months, with the third month in between not all that positive, it puts the 3-month change as ever so slightly negative, just fractionally negative. But that's the first time we see any negative in any 3-month change for weekly earnings since August of 2020, and it's not even close. Over the almost 5 years since August of 2020, the lowest 3-month rate for weekly earnings was 0.6%, plus 0.6%. That's how weak and how unusual average weekly earnings have been over the last 3 months. So April, May, and June. I've said it already a couple times before in this video, but it bears repeating. This is highly unusual weakness. And it's highly unusual weakness where it really hurts. Nominal paychecks. Highly unusual. While everyone was going crazy over the payroll report headline, this is happening where it really matters in weekly earnings. And like I said, it only happened once in the entire 2010s. And that was October 2012, right when the Fed was so worried about the economy, it restarted QE for the third time. And before then, before the Great Not Recession, there were no 3-month periods when weekly earnings were negative in the entire middle 2000s. In fact, it only happened twice during the dot-com recession. And those 2 times happened to be September and October 2001. What we're seeing in nominal paychecks and incomes overall is highly unusual weakness. So it stands to reason that consumers are not just pessimistic about tariffs, they are concerned about their jobs and incomes because their incomes are already being impacted. And Amazon knows it. Consumers are reacting to this weakness in the labor market. That's very real weakness. The fact that this data here comes from the same establishment survey as the headline payroll figure is everything. So everyone's going nuts over a slightly positive, highly suspect non-farm job estimate that has been shown to be unbelievably unreliable. Meanwhile, the very same survey says average weekly paychecks over the past 3 months have been so unusually weak, we've only seen it happen a handful of times over the last 30 years. And all of those times are associated with the most negative labor market cases. 2001 dot-com recession, 2008 to 2009, even the one time in 2012, there was no hiring in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. Then, of course, 2020, and now here we are in 2025. While everyone is positive the economy's fine, we keep seeing from companies like Amazon and data like income and spending that shows it is not fine. And the hours and earnings data more closely corresponds to the household survey anyway. Over the past 2 months, in May and June, employment utterly collapsed. Employment was down 600,000 in those 2 months combined. And the labor force itself, maybe the most important statistic, didn't just shrink more, it absolutely crashed, falling by 750,000. And they didn't drop out to go on vacation or retire. They dropped out and stopped looking for work because there is no work. That's why the adjusted unemployment rate, which actually tries to capture these dropouts, is very nearly 5% and still rising. All of this data corresponds closely together. It's telling you the same thing from all these different angles because this thing is actually happening. Again, Amazon knows it. That's why there's a 4-day Amazon Prime Day. I mean, consumers had already been pulling back from the very beginning of this year. Retail sales fell in January, and so did overall PCE, which includes spending on services. And it's kept right on through the first half of this year, up to May, which is the latest data for most of these figures. But there's not going to be any change in June. There was only the one increase in spending in March as purchasing activity picked up to beat tariff price changes that haven't really been coming since then. And the reason why they haven't been coming is everything that we talked about here. That's another one that we almost never see. Real personal consumption expenditures are negative on a 5-month basis, meaning the entire first 5 months of this year. And it's the first time any 5-month basis have seen negative spending since 2020. And this one too, just like in average weekly earnings, it only happened once during the entire 2010s of the silent depression. So you put it together with incomes and now consumer revolving credit, it is not just negative sentiment. Consumers are reacting to very real and very established, pun intended, economic and labor market weakness. It is not just sentiment. Consumers appear to have finally hit the wall, and it's showing up all over the place, including Amazon Prime Day. So for Prime Days, there are now fewer deals and a longer sale event because weak consumer spending has been there the entire time, and Amazon knows it. Why? For one thing, the reason merchants aren't discounting like they did before is they can't. Their margins are already being pressed down too far. And with sales weak to begin with and costs now rising, employers more broadly are cutting back on their other costs, meaning employees, the very thing that consumers have been worried about and warning about the entire year. Employees know it and have known it, which is why consumer sentiment plunged earlier in 2025. But it wasn't just concerns, it wasn't just worries, it wasn't just emotion. Companies have carried through on their job cutting. Hours are down, and most importantly, paychecks are as weak as we've seen on only a handful of occasions in the last 3 decades. Consumers pulling back on credit cards is just more confirmation of everything. The forgot how to grow consumer economy does appear to have remembered how to hit the wall. And if indeed the consumer economy has hit the wall really hard, that would certainly lead toward zero interest rates. In fact, the Federal Reserve just recently said we can't rule out a return to ZIRP. That's in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. I hope to see you tomorrow at our webinar. Link in the description. Huge thanks to Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.